Why is Afghanistan experiencing a humanitarian emergency? What has changed for Afghanistan's people since the US-led occupation was replaced by Taliban rule 6 months ago? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Ali Latifi. Ali Latifi is an Afghan-American journalist. He spent 8 years working in Afghanistan after returning to Kabul, the city of his birth, in 2013. During more than a decade reporting on the situation in Afghanistan, Latifi traveled to more than 15 provinces in the country and followed Afghan refugees in Turkey, Greece, and Italy. His work has appeared in numerous leading international media. Ali Latifi, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start with the recent decision by the United States to unfreeze $7 billion in US-based assets belonging to the Afghan Central Bank. Although the executive order reserves half this amount for what it terms US victims of terrorism, the US nevertheless describes its initiative as one to address the humanitarian and economic crisis in Afghanistan, in the US government words. Help us make sense of this measure and how it either addresses or deepens the humanitarian emergency in Afghanistan.
I would love to make sense of it if I fully understood the decision behind it. My understanding is that a group of 9/11 victims' families had filed suit against the United States and basically demanded recompense for their family's loss. And eventually they wanted to hold the Taliban accountable, from my understanding, even though the Taliban themselves had nothing to do with the 9/11 attack. And then eventually Biden made the decision that he was going to address this grievance or this petition by taking, there was about $7 billion of Avalon money and assets. So that included gold and other assets as well, that was being held in the US Federal Reserve for safekeeping. Because if you know anything about the last 20 years in Afghanistan, the former governments were highly corrupt. There was a lot of theft, there was a lot of fraud. And so one way to make sure, because this was the money and the assets that kept the banking system in Afghanistan going. The Afghan Central Bank is very similar to the US Federal Reserve. You know, they keep the money supply going. They make sure that other banks can operate properly, that they have cash on hand, that their deposits, you know, if they get past a certain amount, can be stored somewhere safely. All of this was the role of the central bank. And that money was being drawn down, that money and assets was, you know, occasionally being drawn down from when the central bank needed it. But as of August, essentially, let's say from August 15th on, the US froze that money. That money and those assets.
At the point at which the
Taliban
US
took over.
Left and the Taliban took over, yes.
Yeah. The US left on August 31st, the Taliban took over on the 15th.
Yeah.
Sometime between then, essentially the US froze those funds completely. Yeah. They froze those funds. And the other thing we have to remember is at least $500 million of that is actually savings from the banks, like people's savings, because, you know, banks don't keep large amounts of cash for many different reasons at the actual branches. Eventually it will go to a Federal Reserve or a central bank or whatever. And then the Afghan Central Bank, you know, took some of that and put it in the US Federal Reserve. So what this has done is completely changed the banking industry in Afghanistan. In the middle of August, like August 12th, 13th on, people were already rushing to the banks in Afghanistan to try and take out as much money as they could, because they knew that the Taliban were getting closer and closer to Kabul. And so in the days leading up to August 15th, the day the former president Ashraf Ghani fled and the day the Taliban walked into Kabul, people were already, essentially they were already runs on the bank. And after the Taliban takeover, banks remained closed for a week or two. No one could get money out. ATMs were barely functioning. Then slowly, the banks reopened. But when they reopened, because you have to remember there's less cash on hand, and there's such a demand for money because Afghanistan is almost 100% cash based.
Right.
It's other than having an ATM card to take money out of an ATM machine, which is still a very small percentage of the population. Every other transaction is done with cash. So whether you're buying food or a car or you're paying your rent, whatever it is, it's almost always cash. Your payments, they may be transferred to your bank, but you'll eventually take it out and spend it as cash. So not having access to cash for a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, however long it is, that's a huge issue for people in Afghanistan. So as soon as the banks reopened, they instated a rule where you could only take up to $200 worth out every week, once a week. Later that moved to 400, but it's still like once a week you can take max now $400 out. And because there were so many people that needed money, and because, as I said, everything is done in cash, you had situations where people were waiting in line, not just for hours at a time to take out money, but in many instances, days at a time. Because essentially what would happen is every day, the central bank would bring cash into the banks. The banks would distribute that money to the people. And the deposits or the electricity payments, things like that they processed weren't enough to make up for the other withdrawals. So essentially, let's say the central bank to your bank branch brought money at 9 a.m. If by 12 p.m. all of that money had been given out, khalas, the bank was closed for the day.
And this is before the asset freeze hit?
This was during the asset freeze.
Yeah.
Yeah, this resulted from the asset freeze.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one thing that happened. Mm-hmm. And then the other part is that, because businesses didn't have cash, they were starting to close. Mm-hmm. Others, say like the heads of the business or whatever, had already left the country. So more and more people were unemployed. So even if people did have money in the bank that they weren't touching, all of a sudden, they had a real need for it, mm-hmm. And they had a need to try and take out as much as they could. So it's become a situation where Afghanistan was always had a very specific population of very poor people, millions of people, depending on the year and the figure, it varied. But let's say a few million people who were extremely poor, who were facing malnutrition, food insecurity, all of those things, living below the poverty line. There was a huge population of people. But now what you have is a situation where it's those people plus the people who had a fairly comfortable life, who maybe they owned a store, maybe they worked in an office, maybe they worked for the government, maybe they worked for the police or the military, and they had some kind of an income. Now, not only are a lot of those income sources gone, but being able to take out that money to pay for your life is all that more difficult. Right. And Biden, by giving the other $3.5 billion to these 9/11 families, he's only adding to that difficulty. Instead of trying to have made it easier for people by saying this was the people of Afghanistan, the banks of Afghanistan, this was their money, this was their assets. It wasn't. Former President Hamid Karzai made a statement a few weeks ago. He said, look, that money wasn't my money. It wasn't Ashraf Ghani, the former president who ran away on August 15th. And it wasn't the Taliban's money. It was the people of Afghanistan.
And now half of it has just been given away. Is that what's happened?
Exactly. Essentially. I mean, I think there's more like court things that need to happen before it's official, but it's been earmarked for that. Mm-hmm. And then the other half is they're going to try and create some kind of a humanitarian system where they don't have to deal directly with the Taliban and distribute it through humanitarian aid. But it's really interesting. You're willing to give humanitarian aid, but you're not willing, you're taking money that's rightfully the people's from them. Do you know what I'm saying?
So the depositors themselves are still prevented from accessing their own current account, savings, whatever.
Yeah, because you have people right now who have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, whatever it is, in the bank that they can only draw down on it $400 at a time. That's
And
their rightful money.
right. And this is kind of one more blow
Hmm.
to the humanitarian and economic crisis that Afghanistan is currently experiencing. In addition to what you've said, can you try to give us a general picture? Because there are constant news reports that it's becoming a real emergency, malnutrition, even the
Hmm.
prospect potentially of famine. But can you give us a picture of what is actually happening on the ground economically and in terms of food insecurity and the humanitarian situation?
Sure. So as I said, there was always issues with food insecurity. There was always issues with poverty. But what's happening now is, and the reason why the UN statistic is that something like 22 million people will be driven into poverty and will face some kind of malnutrition or food insecurity, is that, as I said earlier, even people who had some kind of a safety, that's now gone away.
Mhm.
And they're having to figure out how to pay for their life going ahead over the next few months,
Yeah.
because so many government offices haven't reopened, or if they have reopened, they only pay a fraction of what they used to pay. Or, for instance, a lot of women have not been able to go back to work for one reason or another. And there are many, many families where the women are the sole breadwinners of those families.
Mhm.
You have private businesses that are no longer operating. So that cash is very rare now. It's much more difficult to come by now.
And
And everyone's
credit is, as you said, has very limited application in
it has
Afghanistan.
very limited applications, but also who are you going to get the credit from now?
Right.
Because the bank is struggling to give people the money they owe them.
Mhm.
The businesses are also wondering how they're going to continue to pay their staffs and how they're going to be able to keep their doors open. Yeah, because in the past, let's say you didn't have money for a while, you could go to the local grocery store, to the local bodega, and say, hey, I don't have money for the month, can I pay you next month? And then they keep a tab for you.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
they
And
knew that
now
you would be
they
good for
have
it.
no security that it will be coming in the next month.
Exactly. And they don't have other customers to make up for that shortfall.
Yeah.
you know so that's part of it. And then you had a drought for so many years, you had natural disasters, you had people being displaced by the conflict and by the natural disasters, who suddenly there's even fewer services for them.
Mhm.
So it's creating more hunger, more food insecurity. And if you had paid attention to Afghanistan over the last 20 years, what you would realize is that it operated through foreign aid,
Mhm.
whether that was direct cash, as in like cash grants or pledges and loans and things like that, or through distributions.
Mhm.
You know, uh, everything was somehow paid for by a foreign organization, a foreign embassy, a foreign grant. Those are all going away. And there are small little injections. The US is sending 300 million at a time, or the EU is sending this much, or the UN is sending this much. But what's happening right now is that the economy has shrunk so much. And to be honest, there wasn't much of an economy to begin with, but it shrunk so much. And you're having to find a way to feed 32, 35, 38 million people somehow. So even that 3.5 billion that the US is going to give in humanitarian aid, it's actually a small percentage of what's needed.
Mhm.
I think people noticed it less in the past because there was always, foreign money coming in. There was always,
New
different.
injection. Yeah.
Exactly. There was always new conferences and things like that to pledge money, that people didn't realize just how much foreign money was needed to keep the country afloat.
And that's now basically ending, if I understand you correctly.
It's very much shrunk.
Yeah.
It shrunk by a great percentage.
And in the
Um,
meantime, the economy is disintegrating, if I
yes,
understand correctly. And
because
at
because
the level
because
of daily life for ordinary people, whether urban or rural, it's becoming a real catastrophe.
because so many people are, as I said, are out of work in one form or another. Right? You have so many government offices that haven't fully reopened. Or, as I said, they're paying 20% of what they used to pay you, or 25% of what they used to pay you. And the ones that aren't letting women return to work, so if you're a 2-income household where a husband and a wife works, well, half the income has automatically gone away now, or if you're a 1-income household where it's only the woman that works, because she's a widow, or because the husband is disabled, or for whatever reason, they've lost 100% of their income.
Yeah.
And then you also have so much divestment from the country. So for instance, one of my cousin's wives, she was a principal at a very elite, expensive private school in Kabul. She was like a vice principal. They shut down that school.
The Taliban.
And moved it. No, the school.
No, the school administration itself.
They shut it down and they moved to Uzbekistan.
Yeah. Because the
And
students
now,
and their families left, basically.
Right. So now that staff isn't without an income.
Yeah.
And it's not as if there are more private schools suddenly opening in their place. So now that family earns less than half of what it used to, because her husband works for the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Finance is paying him I saw that for 1 month's work, they paid him the equivalent of $100 and something.
And in the coming months, it's expected to get significantly worse, I think.
Exactly, because again, there's no new injections. People are afraid to start businesses and investments. So many big investors left in the initial days. Some left even before the full Taliban takeover. The economy was already the last trip I made outside of Kabul was in July, right before the Eid al-Qurban holiday, the Eid of the sacrifice. And I went to Herat, one of the biggest cities in the country, a commercial hub, a commercial center. And I went around the market and I asked, what, for instance, for Eid, everybody buys new clothes, and they were saying, all the tailors were saying, our business is down 50, 60, 90% this year. When I went to the shepherds who were selling the sheep and the goats and the cows that, you would sacrifice, there was nobody there. There was nobody buying. They were back before this, one businessman would come and buy 20 goats.
So it was a good Eid for livestock.
Yeah, exactly. Like the sheep and the goats and whatnot were happy, but the actual people had no money. And this was a full month before.
So this leads me to my next question, which is that the US-led occupation was repeatedly advertised as an exercise in nation building. Yet only months after it ended, the economy has collapsed and more than 20 million Afghans are confronting hunger in a dysfunctional state. What does this tell us about how the US and its local and international partners ruled Afghanistan during the previous 2 decades? And what does it tell us about the Taliban's capacity for government?
So, first of all, it wasn't within months, it was within days that the economy collapsed. And what it tells us is that whether it was the former Islamic Republic or their backers in the West, nobody ever had a plan for a sustainable economy.
Right. And sorry, when you say Islamic Republic, you're referring to the Karzai and the Ghani government.
Exactly, those two governments, right? Because the Taliban is the Islamic Emirate.
Right.
So, there was no, if you think about it, there was no real production out of Afghanistan. There was no real large, massive exports out of Afghanistan. Everything was imported. We used to joke that when you saw the road coming from Jalalabad to Kabul, when it would get to, because after Jalalabad is the Torkham crossing, which eventually leads to Pakistan. The joke was, if you looked at the side coming into Kabul, the road was completely, in tatters, but the road going out was just fine because we had so many more imports than we did exports. If you were to go into an Avalon market then or now, you would see that 99% of the products came from Pakistan or from Iran. So there was very little that was produced there was no real manufacturing. You know, there weren't factories, there weren't, not any large scale ones. There were some, of course, but like not these. Yeah.
So in the aftermath of the Soviet war during the 80s, then the Civil War, then the period of Taliban misrule, during the US-led occupation, you're basically saying there wasn't a strategy to get the Afghan economy back on its feet.
No, because the proof is literally in the fact that the day after the former president fled, millions of people were without an income all of a sudden, immediately. And the banks suddenly collapsed. The moment that those assets were frozen, the banks essentially collapsed. The banks wondered what to do. They could not keep up with the demand. And the investors and the businessmen did not have enough faith to stay in the country and try and weather, you know, this massive storm. And, you know, you didn't have, you know, Afghanistan is a highly agricultural country, but it hasn't been properly food secure over the last 20 years. And again, we had probably dozens of ministers of agriculture. So why is it that we had all of these agriculture ministers, and yet there was never any proper plan, any real plan of how to take the pomegranates of Kandahar and the saffron of Herat and the oranges of Nangarhar and the apples of Waldak and the potatoes of Bamyan, and somehow try and export those to the region at least, or to use them in a way to feed your own people.
Okay, so that was never on the U.S. agenda. That was never on the agenda of the foreign governments that were also participating in the occupation. But if I understand you correctly, you're also saying it wasn't really on the agenda of the successive Afghan governments either.
No, and this was the other thing about, you were saying about how did they rule, is that they were highly corrupt. You know, if you think about like out of the last four ministers of finance, the last three had allegations of fraud and corruption. In 5 years,
that's at the heart of the economy.
Yeah, exactly, right? And then so many other ministers, you know, the vice presidents, the different warlords, the different MPs, all of them were accused of different parts of corruption. If you look at the Kabul bank crisis, in the 2009-10, basically the biggest private bank in the country almost collapsed because of bad loans, bad spending, bad management, fraud, corruption, all of these things. Hamid Karzai's brother was involved in it. His former vice president, Marshal Fahim, and his family were allegedly involved in it. You know, other former ministers and MPs and high-level businessmen were involved. They were named, but none of them really faced real jail time or real penalties.
Well, some people would say this is an example of misrule and bad coincidence, and other people would say it's in fact in the very nature of such arrangements, where you effectively have a partnership between foreign governments and local elites that are almost designed to have these outcomes. What do you make of those arguments?
That's exact. I believe it was designed to have that outcome, because if you talk to certain businessmen, if you talk to certain investors about different plans and projects that they had, they were shut down, or they were told, no, we're not allowed to do this. And at the same time, if you look at these people who were in charge of the economy, who were in charge of the agriculture and the development and the business, there was no real proof that they created anything sustainable, that they, as I said, like something as simple as manufacturing, there was no real large scale manufacturing in Afghanistan.
Right. And now, and now looking at the period since August 15th, okay, the situation was a disaster, but have the Taliban attempted or succeeded to do anything to at least prevent this precipitous decline, or have they showed an incapacity for governance themselves as well?
I think it's two things. On the one hand, they're in a situation where they can't, because, as I said, the former government was highly reliant on aid and assistance from outside, and they don't have that, right? But on the other hand, on the other hand, they don't have the technical skill. They don't have the understanding of how to run an economy, of how to run a bank, of how a foreign minister is supposed to act, of how an education minister is supposed to act. They don't have, they did not appoint educated, capable people. They just basically appointed lawyers. They could have, yes. They could have either picked people who had been around, who weren't part of the former governments. They could have picked people who were part of the former governments, but were willing to work with them. Or they could have just picked people that are actually capable, but they didn't do that. And of course, well, it would have actually been good for them, because if you look at it, the last government, the government of Ashraf Ghani, was called like the technocrat government, but it was considered the most corrupt. So this would have been a great PR stance for the Taliban to be like, we're going to hire real quote unquote technocrats, and we're going to make sure they're not corrupt.
Yeah. But
because the Taliban are just essentially appointing mullah, like if you look at their cabinet, half of them, the title is Maulawi. Maulawi or Akhund or whatever, or mullah or this or Aji. There's very few doctor, engineer, anything like that within their government.
Clerical rule, effectively.
Exactly. So, these people don't have that experience. It's like putting me in charge of, you making me the Minister of Economy in Afghanistan, Minister of Finance in Afghanistan. I don't know anything about running an economy. But just because I'm their friend, I get the job.
Right. So speaking of friends, I'd like to refer to an article you recently wrote for The Nation about the British government prioritizing the evacuation of cats and dogs over Afghans who worked with the British. In that article, you wrote that this episode speaks volumes about the occupation. I'm quoting you now. It speaks volumes about the occupation and how the forces and governments behind it view the people of Afghanistan, end quote. What did you mean by this? Tell us a bit about this episode for those of us who are unfamiliar with it.
Basically, in the last days of the foreign drawdown, there was an NGO, like an animal shelter run by a former British Marine, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Whose whole thing was about rescuing cats and dogs and donkeys. And he asked for a charter plane to help him evacuate his staff and his animals. When the plane finally came, he was on the plane, his animals were on the plane, none of his staff was on the plane. Eventually, the staff
were Afghans.
Yeah. Eventually, weeks later, they made it into Pakistan and they were safe. But in the immediate time, they were not allowed into the airport. They were not allowed on that plane. The plane took off without them. And now there are reports, because Boris Johnson was accused of okaying this.
Which he denied at the time.
Exactly, which he denied at the time. And then a few weeks ago, emails leaked showing that he seemingly did okay this.
And had personally intervened.
Exactly, that he had personally intervened and that he did okay this and that he knew what was going on. Because he made it seem like he didn't know what was going on until it came out on the news.
Right.
And so what I meant by that is that if you were in Afghanistan in May, June, or July, you would have seen that every single person you came across was asking you, how do I get an SIV? How do I get one of those? Later the US and other countries said, we're not just giving SIVs to people who worked with us in the military.
SIV being a special immigrant.
Special immigrant visa, yeah. We're also going to give extra special visas to like rights workers, to famous women, to media professionals, to whatever, but what they never did was explain to people how to get those visas. They never created a system. There was never an official website that gave clear steps. There was never any kind of a hotline. You couldn't go to the embassies and ask questions. So these people were left desperately attempting, like if they had any interaction with a foreigner, they would ask you for help. Can I go? Can I talk to this person? What do I have to do for this visa? These people had no answers. They were stuck. And a lot of them were rejected for very simple clerical reasons. For instance,
Administrative errors on their application.
Exactly. Not even necessarily errors. Like you may have documents that have, for instance, different spellings of your name or different like for instance, my Afghan passport says Muhammad Ali. My US passport says Ali Muhammad.
Yeah. That would be
Right?
enough to get your application rejected.
That would be enough to get your application canceled. Or if, let's say, I worked for the US forces, I thought, oh, it's from March 2016 to February 2017. They're like, no, actually, it was from February to March.
Yeah.
And you could get canceled for that. Or if you didn't fully know, say, your grandfather's name, or if you thought you came from one village and you were from another, any sort of thing that you could have, any sort of simple thing that you could have made an error on would get you canceled right away.
Yeah. And if we look more broadly at the plight of those who were evacuated and those who
are still stuck there,
who are still there, and you look at leaks, not only the story we've just been discussing, but also information seeing the light of day now in, for example, other European countries, at least the impression I'm getting is that there was a general attitude of these people have served their purpose, and the fewer of them get out, the better. Is that an accurate description?
That's, like I said, that's what it seemed like, because there was no system in place. And people were desperate. Even after the Taliban takeover, for instance, our bureau, the Al Jazeera Bureau, was on the street near the British, Canadian, and French embassies. I would be walking on the street and people would stop and ask me, where's the British embassy? How do I get into the British embassy? And you would just see hundreds of people lining up outside the gate leading to the street to where the British embassy is, unsure of what to do, unsure of whether or not there's any embassy staff there. But because that they had heard that the British embassy was going to evacuate people, they just stood out there, in the sun, hoping that something would happen. And then when they got completely desperate, they just waited outside the airport.
Yeah, and you saw all those appalling scenes, and
tens of thousands of people. It was like a little village. It was disgusting. Like there was like this putrid water. There was people just sitting in the dirt. There was gunshots everywhere. It was insanity.
Yeah.
But people were desperate to get out. And again, it's because there was no system, there was no information, there was no procedure for these people.
And was this part of, was this simply poor administration, or do you also feel that there was a sense of we want as few of them coming to our countries as necessary?
I think you'd have to ask them. I would imagine it's a bit of both.
Yeah. Well, the document,
and one leads to the other.
Yeah.
If it's just poor administration, well, poor administration also makes sure that very few people get in.
Yeah.
In a way, you don't even have to come out right and say it. But because this was when I first heard about these visas, I thought it was like applying to college in the US, right? Where, there's a website, it gives you information, you fill out forms, you upload what you need to, and then eventually you get a response.
Fat chance.
But there's nothing like that. It was like, if let's say I worked for you, whether we were in the military or some kind of a private contractor, I would have to contact you. You would have to know who in the US or UK, whatever military government to contact, the proper format of a letter to send. Your explanation of who I am would have to match exactly with my explanation, like to the letter. And then somehow I would have to know that I'm in the process.
And it seems in many cases, without some form of special pleading, nothing would happen.
Right. And the other part, yes. And the other part is that, let's say I worked for you 10 years ago. Do you even remember me?
Yeah.
And if you remember me, like to give you the benefit of the doubt, maybe you remember me and you want to help me, But and this happened. A lot of people were saying this. Like we reached out to our superiors, and they were like, "We would love to help you, but we don't know what to do either."
Mhm.
Is there a website we're supposed to, go to? Is there a phone number we're supposed to call? So everybody was making it up as they went along, trying to figure this out. And there were a few like sort of offices that had opened up that were like advanced, kind of like in-person call centers, right?
Mhm.
That you would go and you would say, "Look, this is where I am in the process. What do I do now?" And you would pay a fee, and they would help you as much. They would just answer your questions. They couldn't do anything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
And then,
and yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
and so again, what did this do? This again privileged the people who had the time and the money to go to these kinds of
And the
centers
connections.
and the connections, and it ensured that so many people were not able to get out.
Right.
Were not even able to properly have their cases studied.
Yeah. Well, and then, by the end of August, the Americans and the other foreign forces left.
Yeah.
Those Afghans that wanted and were able to leave did. And those that wanted to remain or couldn't leave remained behind. And the Taliban took over, which leads me to my next question is, how does Taliban rule today compare with that during their first stint in power during the 1990s?
It is different, in the most basic ways that, television still operates, the media still operates for the most part. They put on a much better face. They say we want the free media, we want women to return to work and to school and to everything. I think that I wasn't around for the first. I just know what my friend said, but in the month that I had no plans of I had to leave. Like something happened where I had to leave. But in the month that I was in the Emirate, and to this day, it became very clear that it was all very ad hoc.
Mm-hmm. You're
That
talking
there
of
weren't
November 2021 now.
that
Yeah.
that there were no clear, hard and fast rules that you could, the higher ups, the ministers, the spokespeople, they could make the most lovely statements to you and assure your safety and your protection, but the talibs on the ground, right? The what do you call it? The foot soldiers?
Yes. Yeah.
They operated as they wanted, and I saw it for myself on several. I mean, for instance, several times again to about what I was saying about the banks. Several times we went outside the banks when I was with Al Jazeera, and the TV correspondent would be trying to film. We would go speak to the commander of the area. He'd be like, "Yes, yes, no problem. Film whatever you want." He would give an interview, perfectly lovely interview, saying we're just here to keep peace and order. But then as soon as the commander stepped a little further away, the foot soldiers would come and try and push your camera,
Yeah.
would try and intimidate you, would ask you what people are asking. I would ask you what you're asking them.
So every Talib is a local commander.
Exactly. Or for instance, I saw Khalil Haqqani, who is now, I think he's the Minister of Refugees, on within the first week. And someone made a joke that, "Oh, Ali doesn't usually wear traditional clothes, but ever since you guys came in, he's doing this." Khalil Haqqani told me Ali can wear whatever he wants. He can dress however he wants. The one day I dressed like this, dozens of talibs pass me by saying nothing, but one comes to me with his gun, confronts me. And at that moment, I was freaking out because I didn't know, is he going to shoot me? Is he going to arrest me? Is he going to beat me up? Nothing. It ended up just being a discussion, but that fear is still there with you because you don't know. For instance, like, so the man who is, related to the current Minister of Interior and who is himself now in a ministry says you can do what you want, you can dress how you want, but then the random guy on the street comes and intimidates you once. The next time, I don't know if he will shoot me. I don't know if he would have shot me the first time. So that's one of the biggest concerns for the people, is that you don't know when you could run afoul of them. You don't know what will actually upset them. You can assume, You can assume certain things and you can try and avoid certain things, but you can't guarantee it.
And there was a lot of talk last year that some people suggested the Taliban had changed. Others said no, they haven't changed, but it's a very different country and a very different Kabul that they're taking over than in the 1990s. To what extent do you concur with those perspectives?
It is definitely. I mean, the Kabul of the 1990s was right after a civil war, right? It was after the Soviet occupation and a civil war. So Kabul was destroyed in the civil war. The civil war was only like 4 or 5 years long, but the city, the Soviet occupation targeted the villages, the provinces.
Rural areas. Yeah.
Exactly, the more rural areas. The civil war was fought entirely on Kabul. All of these different warlords, were perched across different sides of the city, and they were just launching rockets at one another. And so Kabul was destroyed. It was in rubble. People were terrified. And one of the things that the Taliban at the time, promised was, we're going to give you safety. We're going to take away these warlords, and we're going to give you safety, and we're going to make sure your women aren't raped anymore, that they aren't abused anymore. And one way for them to do that is to put on the chadari, the burqa, and not go to work, not go to school for a while, because there's still bandits and vandals, and
so they delivered, but also delivered a lot more.
And they didn't loosen up ever, right? Because they kept saying like, oh, these are only temporary, but of course it never. And then it got to like, you have to have a beard, and you have to dress this way, and you have to do this, and you have to.
Is there a similar dynamic at work now, in the sense that peace has returned to many of these areas that were
right?
Where the insurgency was being fought, and now there's no more bombings, there's no more. Have you seen a similar dynamic at work?
Of course. Of course that's there. But the other problem is that the way it seems is that, again, when you talk about ad hoc, it's not just ad hoc on the streets of whatever city you're in, it's ad hoc in the provinces. Yeah. The Taliban in Mazar act a certain way. The Taliban in Jalalabad act a certain way. The Taliban in Kandahar act a certain way. So again, there isn't a real system. When I remember I talked to one of them in September, and he was like, "Oh, we brought priests in order," and I said, "But what order?" No one feels safe right now. Yes, you feel safe from suicide bombings, but you don't feel safe in other ways. Yeah. And why is it that, the city of Jalalabad has gotten so much more violent and scary? Why is it that people in the city of Mazar feel watched and very weary the entire time? So that's part of it. And then, like you said, yes, Afghanistan has changed. And yes, Kabul has changed, because, again, you're talking about coming out of a civil war, and then you're talking about, with all of its problems, with everything that happened, you're talking about 20 years of the Islamic Republic, where there was not as much as there should have been, but some level of development, some level of empowerment, some level of advancement. Again, not nearly as much as it should have been, but to some degree. Mm-hmm. And you're coming up in a world where everybody has access to the internet on their phone.
Right. That's something that they haven't sought to shut down.
Right. And so now you have, who's leading, whatever you may think of their tactics or what comes of it, who's leading the protests against the Taliban? It's women. Mm-hmm. And all they're just asking for their right to school and their right to work. That's it. Nothing else. But that is terrifying them, right? Because these women are going missing. These women are allegedly being abused. These journalists who report on their protests are being thrown into jail and tortured and abused. Which
demonstrates how seriously they're taking these acts of opposition.
Exactly. So, and this is sort of the other thing that, I think that a lot of people feel is that if you're in Afghanistan today, if you're in the Islamic Emirate, you have no choice. You have to accept the Taliban. They took over. Khalas. They won the war. They are the government now. So you have, by default, accepted them. They are the leader now. You didn't have a choice. You may not like it, but they are, right? And so now the question is, can the opposite happen? can they accept you? Right? Can they see, if you can see that not every Talib is a suicide bomber, then can they see that not every person in Kabul and Herat and Jalalabad and these cities is not some decadent hedonist, you know? That they're still Afghan, they're still Muslim, you know, they're just trying to live their life.
Yeah.
And until those two sort of meet and come to some kind of an awareness and agreement and understanding of each other, nothing is going to get, so it requires both sides.
And in the meantime, what's their base of support? What are their main constituencies, and are they able to operate as a unified movement?
Well, clearly they're not operating as a unified movement because,
you
as
said
I said,
as much. Yeah,
it's as simple as what's going on the ground. It's, if you look at sort of the reports about the splits in the higher levels,
yeah,
about different appointments. If you look at, you know, for instance,
this is kind of factional conflict at the top of the movement.
yeah, because you can have someone, you know, you can have someone who has all the support in Kabul, but doesn't know how to get any help in Kandahar or Mazar. You know, because like the faction that you know is good here and has power over here and has sway over here,
but is irrelevant there. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
In terms of their support base, you know, part of it I think now is just people who, like I said, have no choice and are like, okay, fine, here, you're here, but just make the best of it, right? And then there were others who really were rightfully disgruntled by the corruption, by the violence, by the killings of civilians of the last 20 years, who were hoping that the Taliban could be a clean alternative to that, and who are still hoping for that. A lot are disappointed now. A lot are saying, you know, we still have to see, or, you know, they're at an unfair disadvantage because they've, despite promises to the contrary, they've become a pariah state from the start again. Like the deck is stacked against them. And so it's hard to know exactly like who or what their support base is. They have a support base. Of course, everyone has a support base. But what's most important is that they understand that they need to take certain actions to get other people to accept them and acknowledge them and say, okay.
And that would be my next question based on what you've just said. Have the Taliban successfully managed to consolidate power over Afghanistan, or is it being challenged by either internal divisions, opposition, or as you've described, or armed opposition movements, perhaps, or maybe a combination of these? What do you make of that?
No, I mean, they still pretty much control. They are in charge. They may not be in charge in an orderly manner or in a proper manner, but they're in charge. And I mean, there's no real armed opposition that's made any actual gains, you know, and even the leaders of that armed opposition are meeting with them secretly in Iran and in, or maybe not so secretly, in Iran and in Russia. So no, I mean, who is the political or the armed opposition to them that's actually legitimate?
Or
and
perhaps
viable?
these more popular forms of protests you referred to, are those a significant threat, or is it?
I think the Taliban see it as a significant threat. I think
more than it is in practice.
Yeah, because it's still it's small groups of people. It's like 20 women, you know, but they're terrified of it. It shows that they have, if you look at it, the largest proportion of violence and detention of journalists has to do with covering those protests.
Interesting.
And again, it's like 15 women, but it terrifies them.
And if you look at outside Afghanistan, NATO forces have left, but there are other foreign powers, some of whom you've mentioned, like Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and India, who each have their interests in the country. To what extent are these foreign powers a significant factor in Afghanistan today? And to what extent is Afghanistan's fate being determined by their various agendas?
They're a huge factor. I mean, on the one hand, we do have to acknowledge, that we had bad government, corrupt government that gave into all kinds of things. But on the other hand, we also have to admit that for probably the entire 20 years, Pakistan and Iran were supporting the Taliban. It's undeniable. It's a fact. People in different areas of the country will say that to you and have been saying that to you. And if you look at their treatment, both of them are saying we don't officially recognize them, but they're still going to see them. They're still meeting them. They're still in their own way saying, give them a chance. They're still sending signals that they would accept their ambassadors. So they're huge factors, and they've always been huge factors because, the water issue is so important to them. This idea of security, that we are somehow a threat to their security, they use to their advantage. The fact that they hate the number of refugees, from our countries, from our country.
Talking now about both Pakistan and Iran.
Both of them.
Yeah.
All of this impacts how they treat our country. And if you look at it over the last 20 years, especially these two had a very interesting relationship where they outwardly supported the Republic, but you also knew that they were aiding and abetting the Taliban at the same time. They were playing both hands at the same time. And right now, yes, they both refuse to accept them, to acknowledge them, to recognize them. And they're both saying, you need an inclusive government, although it's interesting, when did Iran have an inclusive government? But still, they're both saying they want an inclusive government in Afghanistan, but they're not really doing very much to put pressure on them.
And if we look specifically at Indo-Pakistani relations, is that a significant factor with respect to Afghanistan?
It is, and I think it was more of a factor during the occupation.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is India and Pakistan are like Pakistan and Iran in that they've both used Afghanistan for their own political aims. India tries to play like the nice one and say, oh, we're building you schools and, we're giving you parliament building. But at the end of the day, it's still a political game that they're playing because they want to upset Pakistan. And I think maybe this is wrong, but I always compared Afghanistan to Lebanon in that like we're surrounded by terrible neighbors who are all using us for their own political benefit.
Yeah.
And what that political benefit changes over time. But at the end of the day, it's still where they fight their battles and where they show their strength.
And if we go back to the beginning of our discussion about the economy and the banking crisis and so on, there's another comparison with
or the corruption, the amount of corruption. Like, why does Beirut not have 24-hour electricity? Because there's so much corruption.
Yeah, and finally, Ali, if you take a look ahead to the coming months to this year, what's your prognosis for Afghanistan in the coming year?
I don't know, to be quite honest, but I think what needs to happen is that the Taliban need to accept certain realities and they need to make certain moves that, I mean, if you look at it, last week, different Gulf countries and the EU met with them. And what did they all talk about? They all talked about women's rights. They all talked about human rights, Even, what was it, like 2 months ago, the Qatari foreign minister made a statement where, and I've lived in Doha, he's right. He's like, we have more women in our government than we do men, And so if the Taliban was smart and wanted to ease the pressure on themselves, that's a way to very easily, that's something that's the first thing they're going to look at you for is how you treat women.
It's something they can and should, but probably won't do.
Exactly. But if they were smart and they wanted to show that they've changed and they wanted to make sure that they get recognized and that the money comes back and that things get a little easier for them, go appoint a female minister. What does it hurt? If you appoint a capable one, if you show that, you're not like the former government, you're not just appointing, inadequate cronies, who are just there as tokens to make the West happy and keep the money coming in. But if you say, I'm going to find a good well-behaved, pious, educated, knowledgeable Afghan woman, and I'm going to make her a minister, I'm going to make her a spokeswoman or something, that would be a huge difference overnight.
Yeah.
You know, or like, for instance, you know, the Qataris and the Turks keep wanting to take over the airports, and they have certain security requests from the Taliban, and for whatever reason, the Taliban won't fulfill those. Why wouldn't you want these countries to take over your airports so that some level of air travel can begin, some level of international business can begin? If they're asking you for something, why aren't you meeting those expectations?
Yeah. Ali Latifi, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights on Afghanistan with connections. Next week on March 2nd, we'll be speaking with the award-winning documentary filmmaker Safa Al-Ahmad on Yemen. Thank you once again.